to you, everyone. It's good to see, I think, most of you again. Most of you were here last week. Now, I want to echo exactly what everything Brent just said. There's a lot of good archaeology out there that relates to the Bible. There is also some archaeology that presents itself as very good with the Bible, but in fact is not really archaeology. And in fact, when we look at it, if we look at it carefully, or really if we try to use it, it actually can backfire and undermine confidence in the Bible. If we put something out there that says this supports what the Bible says, and what if it turns out to not really be what they say it is? Then it can make us look like we're just grasping at anything out there, even if it's not really true. And so what am I talking about? I guess when we talk about Egypt, don't most of us go to the Exodus or something like that? Because that's famous. When Charlton Heston pulled everyone out from Pharaoh Yul Brynner. Great story. Of course, we watched the old classic movie. There's a lot of fiction put in there. They put a love interest for. I haven't seen it in a long time. Don't they have a love interest for Joshua in there somewhere? Anyway, I haven't seen it in a long time. And they have other versions like the Prince of Egypt movie, which is older also, but not as old as what we're seeing right there. But if I were to ask, have you seen anything in the news or on social media or heard about anything someone shared with you? Maybe one of the things you would have seen or heard about is something with chariot wheels on the bottom of the Red Sea. And maybe you've seen pictures like these, or maybe even these pictures. So-and-so, they found chariot wheels in the bottom of the Red Sea, proof of the Exodus, proof of the Bible. And we can't possibly analyze every single claim or anything, but I'll go ahead and tell you, watch out for these, because one thing to ask when they find things like this, how do we know that's really what they say it is? Because the Red Sea has had people sailing on it for thousands of years. Is there a chance there's anything on the bottom of the Red Sea that originates with something besides the Exodus? How many shipwrecks have there been in thousands of years? How many things, for one reason or another, have gone down in the Red Sea over thousands of years? And you see things like this. Are they chariot wheels in the Red Sea? Are they proof of the Exodus? And at least with these images right here, here's what we know. People have not brought these up to look at them. They've just taken pictures and then gone up and shown the pictures and make a lot of money on a lecture circuit or making videos, YouTube, things like that. There's a lot of money in fake or bad archaeology. There's a lot of it because there are a lot of Christians just ready to support something that seems or claims to support the Bible. And so many people, for the best intentions, you'll want to support it financially or support the people. There's a lot of money in it. And we could do a whole lesson on how to recognize or suspect, one way or the other. Is this real? Is this legitimate? And without going into all that, one question to ask or to investigate, are the people doing this actually archaeologists? And if we investigate, a lot of the time, maybe most of the time actually, with stories like this, they're not. They might have something in international relations or something in some other field, something very different. The one who's behind these, one of the chief people, he's a nurse anesthetist, which is an important job, but it's nothing to do with archaeology. And he's made a lot of money with these claims, and he's also claimed to have found the Ark of the Covenant. He's also claimed several other big things. He's not an archaeologist, but many people don't really investigate that. But even looking at these, one thing we know is that chariot wheels in ancient Egypt, we found chariots. Egyptian sand preserves things very well. If you go to Cairo, I was there last March, I'm looking to go again next March with the group. They have this brand new huge museum, and there's one area with a whole bunch of chariots, ancient chariots set up. They had wheels made of wood. Their wheels are made of wood. Look at the left-hand picture. Does that look like wood? It's kind of shiny. It looks metallic, doesn't it? Of course, there's one way to tell for sure. You bring it up and analyze it, and that was not done. And of course, what usually happens to wood over time underwater or on land? Yeah, it's organic. It disintegrates. With things like this, these are some of the other images that have been claimed. And how on earth can you tell what that is? It could be anything, couldn't it? But people who do these don't collect samples. They don't bring them up and show them on the surface. They just show these underwater images, which are obscure enough you really can't, do much with. It's easy to just leave it where it is, and some people won't ever question anything. Just guessing something, bring it up and show. They're made of wood, which disintegrates underwater, so you probably wouldn't find chariot wheels made of wood, underwater after 3,500 years anyway. What are the chances? Probably not. And something else to think about if we're looking for evidence of an Exodus, it's not surprising we'd have a hard time finding evidence of that. And this is the big thing when we think of archaeology in the Bible with Egypt. We want to go here, but what would we really expect to find? What will we expect to find? The location of the crossing is still debated. We don't know exactly where they crossed. And there are some people who say, we know exactly where it was, but all they do is just make educated guesses, and that's about it. We don't actually have we have no physical evidence to pin it down 100%. So there's that uncertainty to deal with. But Egyptians, if we want to look at a record, like a history or a tablet or an inscription, are the Egyptians going to have written down all about their failure? No, king in ancient times, you always win, at least in your version of things. There's one huge battle in history between Ramses II, one of the great pharaohs of Egypt. He's always the one in the movies. And the Hittite Empire up in what's now Turkey. They had a huge battle, and Ramses went up there to attack and expand, and his forces got spread out, and the Hittites attacked, and he was almost annihilated until his last division finally arrived and saved the day. They called it a draw. The two kings shook hands, agreed to leave things as they were before. They both went home, and they each claimed to have won. That's typical. Kings never record themselves losing something. You'll be assassinated the next day. You're a loser. And someone else will see you that way. They'll kill you, kill your family, and replace you. So you don't record your failures. You don't record your weaknesses or defeats. The Egyptians are not going to record how an invisible god of slaves humiliated the great gods of Egypt. You're not going to find that. No, they wouldn't have done it. And the Hebrews, they left with tents, and they lived for a long time just, camping out. They didn't build permanent structures on the way. What's there to find on their Exodus route? You go to modern-day Bedouins who live the same way, and it's hard to tell they've been there sometimes. They take everything with them, and it's hard to find anything to leave behind, especially after time goes by. Archaeologically, archaeology looks for things that are built or put together, stone, clay pots, things like that. And people living like the Hebrews didn't tend to leave things lying around. So are they archaeologically invisible, the Hebrews? Probably, at least when they went out. So, but if we're looking at archaeology in the Bible with Egypt, there is a lot there. And we don't have to just bump into this and, I wish we had something about the Exodus. Well, forget the whole thing. No, there's actually a good bit. And actually, it's the smaller things that aren't as sensational that carry greater weight, I believe. A lot of scholars have questioned whether the Hebrews ever came out of Egypt at all. A lot of them just write it off as a myth. Interestingly, the Egyptians have always remembered it. You go to Egypt and you talk to the Arabs in Egypt and the Egyptians there, and they've always remembered that, and it's never been forgotten. It's usually European and American, white-skinned scholars that throw doubt on it, as if they know better today than people 3,000 years ago, whether something actually happened or not. But there's evidence in the Bible that is supported by archaeology, that there's a connection with the Hebrews. They actually have Egyptian origins in their culture that we see in the Bible. And we'll look at a few things. Let's start with a very early artifact, not so famous, but if you go to the older big museum in Cairo, it's one of the first things you see when you walk in. It's called the Narmer pallet. It's made out of stone. It's about maybe this tall, 2.5 feet, something like that, tall. You can see on there the picture of a pharaoh. He's bigger than everyone else, and the pharaoh's name is Narmer. He's actually one of the earliest pharaohs before Abraham. That's him, and this is important for a lot of artistic and design reasons. We don't need to go into all that. But what's happening here? You see Pharaoh, and he's about to whack a guy on the head who's on his knees down there to the right. And look up at the top right, you see a bird. Let's see if I can zoom in here. Whoops, too much. Okay, there we go. See that bird? That's a falcon god called Horus. And you see he has something, it's kind of weird looking. It's like a human head with this long thing and stuff coming off the top. That's supposed to be a lotus plant. And the king that the Pharaoh has just defeated is being presented wrapped up in a lotus plant. And there are cultural and religious reasons for that. We don't need to go into all that. To us, to them, that was perfectly normal. To us, it's weird, but that's not what I want to focus on. That's the falcon god Horus presenting an enemy king to Pharaoh. What I want to look at, different computers. Okay, what I want to look at is actually, is that guy. Because this is carved in stone. So everything you see is an intentional artistic choice. They carved Pharaoh the way they did. They carved the falcon god Horus the way they did. Why did they carve that guy at all? He's very small, but why is he there? Why did they choose to put him in there? And if you zoom in, he's holding something with his left hand. Well, both hands really, but what's going on? What is that? It's not that big, but if we zoom in, there's a lot of detail. Look at the detail, on Pharaoh and his clothing. But look, what's the guy holding? What's that look like? Those are shoes. They're sandals. Whose are they? Why would you chisel that in there in such detail? Obviously, the artist intended to do that. So why? If you look at an armor, he doesn't have any shoes on. He's barefoot. And that's actually something we see consistently throughout Egyptian history. This is the earliest example of it. When a pharaoh is in the presence of a god, the shoes are off. He's barefoot. Now, if you look at other images and statues and there's no god present, the Egyptians almost always put sandals on them. You can see them. But in this case, this is the earliest example of this idea that Egyptians in the presence of a god are barefoot. And we see that here. Is that a biblical connection? Well, I think so. See his bare feet? The sandals are back there. So, intentional choice. So does that remind us of a story? Some of you may already be thinking about it. Does it remind us of a story in the Bible? Moses, when he's been out in the wilderness for decades after fleeing Egypt, there's a burning bush. And God calls out to him from the bush in Exodus 3. And he says, Moses, do not come near. What's the first thing God says to him? I am the God. No, the first thing he says is, take off your sandals. You're standing on holy ground. And what does Moses do? He does it. Isn't that a curious way to make introductions? You ever wondered why those are the first words God says? But Moses doesn't know God's in the bush. He just sees a bush that looks like it's burning but not being consumed. And he approaches it. The Bible says he was wondering what's going on. Why is this? And then a voice. And what does that instruction immediately tell Moses? Moses was raised where? In Egypt. So if a voice is telling you, take off your sandals, holy ground, if you're an Egyptian, you understand immediately you're in the presence of God or a God. He talked to Moses in terms Moses already understood. Moses, we're told in Acts 7, Stephen's defense before the Sanhedrin, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of Egypt. He was culturally raised he knew Egyptian culture. He knew this. And so when we find this in the Bible, how many times do we find this in the Bible? Moses, first time. Do we find any other stories where this happens? There's one more. Joshua, right? Before Jericho, Joshua's out there. They've already crossed the Jordan River, and Joshua's there. And a guy appears, and Joshua challenges him, are you friend or foe? And the guy says, take off your shoes. You're on holy ground. And what does Joshua understand immediately? Where was Joshua raised? Egypt. So those are the only two times in the Bible we have that kind of interaction, where God tells someone first thing, take off your shoes, holy ground. Both times it's to someone raised in Egypt. He's using their Egyptian knowledge to reveal himself. They understand instinctively, just culturally, if you're in the presence of a God, take off your sandals. And God knows they know that, so he approaches them as if they're Egyptian, because in a sense they are. They're Jewish, they're Hebrews, but from Egypt. And that raises a point. I mentioned this last week. In what language does God speak to people throughout history? And the answer is whatever they already understand. But it's not just language, it's cultural idioms. The parables of Jesus, they're Jesus teaching people using things they know. Work, business, investments, relationships, things they already understand in their culture. Cultural language, day-to-day language. Jesus uses that, harnesses that to teach about the kingdom. And that's what he's doing here. He's revealing himself in terms they already understand. He reveals more, but both Moses and Joshua, being from Egypt, knew exactly where they were. They were in the presence of God, or the one he had sent. And so we see that Egyptian origin reflected in these stories. We don't see it in later generations because the other generations were not born in Egypt. They weren't raised with that in the same way. So God doesn't use that anymore, at least that we have recorded anyway. But let's look at something else that might give a connection for us. The Ark of the Covenant, the thing Indiana Jones found, back in the 30s. But what was it? It's very famous. It was a wooden box, acacia wood, if we read the descriptions in the Law of Moses, a wooden box overlaid with gold. On top, 2 cherubim, like these heavenly beings. And then we know from the story they put different things inside, like the 10 Commandments. Later on, some manna, Aaron's rod that budded. And God's presence was said to have dwelt there. They weren't allowed to look at it because it was so holy. They always kept, when they were carrying it around, it was always covered by several fabrics or skins. No one could ever look at it. And of course, when it was set up in the tabernacle or temple, it was behind a huge veil and kept in the dark. There's no light source back there. And the high priest went back there one day a year, but he'd light incense before he went in. And so when he pulls the curtain back, the veil to enter, all that smoke is in the air, and the light's back there, but the smoke blocks it. So that probably helped prevent him from looking on it again, at least a good look, being so dark there. He was so holy. And it's interesting, when God tells the Hebrews, build an ark, and here are the dimensions, make it of acacia wood, etc., etc., we never have Moses and the Israelites say, what's an ark? When he told them to build an ark and had the dimensions, they don't ask any questions, really. Why is that? And I think the answer is because they already knew what an ark was. How would they know that? What is an ark? It's from Egypt. If you go to Egyptian temples, in fact, this right here, what does that look like? Kind of looks like an Ark of the Covenant, doesn't it? Can you look in and see? Let me use this cool, powerful laser pointer Brent just showed me. Yeah. The handles. They're handles. They're like carrying handles. They actually extend out and then retract back in. And there are 2 on the other side also. So it's designed to be carried. You know where this came from? King Tut's tomb. This is one of the many, many objects in King Tut's place. It's a sacred box that's almost 3,500 years old. Look at the wood. It looks like it was made yesterday, doesn't it? The preservation of Egypt's environment is incredible. But that is a sacred chest. Inside were sacred relics buried with King Tut in his tomb. And look at this next one. This was also found in Tut's tomb. Does that look familiar? It's similar to the Ark of the Covenant in some ways, isn't it? You see the carrying poles, these aren't retractable or anything. They're just there, but it's a box, and inside you could put things. And on top is a religious figure, this time the god Anubis. And this was in King Tut's tomb as well. And inside this chest, they had some sacred objects related to the worship of Anubis. This was actually set up near the front of the tomb. When you broke in, this is one of the first things you saw. Anubis was guarding King Tut, from this box. But these were both made shortly after the time of the Exodus. But if you go back earlier than that, we see references to arks. Every Egyptian temple had one room called a Holy of Holies, or it functioned like a Holy of Holies, and inside they had an ark. And the ark held sacred relics. Here's one in the temple called Edfu. This is not the original ark. The original one is now in the Louvre in Paris, where the Mona Lisa is. This is a replica, but this is a Holy of Holies in a city called Edfu, an ancient temple. And we see the carrying poles on it, and you see it's shaped like a boat, and there's a central area, and inside you put objects, and it's on a pedestal. This is inside a Holy of Holies, an Egyptian temple, and this idea goes back before Moses, before the Exodus. Egyptian temples had a section that worked like the most holy place, and they had an ark that held sacred objects and was dedicated to a god. Now, some people look at that and they say, the Israelites are just copying Egypt. It's not really from God, it's from man. Hang on. There's another way to look at it. When God's telling the Hebrews how to understand him, did God ever use things already existing and redefine them? Last week we talked about it again, didn't we? God's talking to the Hebrews how to approach him, how to understand him. He's teaching them what holiness even means. They've heard of the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. There weren't really any rules or a code or anything for how to worship him properly like that. He was the invisible God of their ancestors. Now he's teaching them the ideas of holiness, sin, and purity. The broken relationship, you need a high priest, and it's setting up all foreshadowing Jesus. But God spoke to people in terms they already understood, and in languages they already understood. And so, how do you want to teach someone about being in the presence of God? They understand Egypt, use an Egyptian reference with the sandals. How do you teach about holiness and an area where God dwells, but we're not permitted to go there because we're not holy like God is? He takes the Holy of Holies and puts up a veil. He takes the idea of an ark and redefines a lot of it for his own purposes. But last week we showed how baptism is actually a redefinition of this ritual immersion Jews practiced all the time in the time of Jesus and the apostles. Even before, every time they went into a synagogue, they'd immerse themselves. Every time they went to the Temple Mount to pray, they'd immerse themselves. It didn't take away sin. It was like the ritual purity washings of the priests in the old law. They took that and made a tradition of doing it for everybody. And when Peter said, all of you repent and be baptized for the remission of your sins, they didn't ask what is baptism because they already practiced a ritual form of immersion, but God took it and redefined it. It's powered by the blood of Christ now, and it's not ritual purity, it's actually to remit your sins, for the forgiveness of sins. He took something they understood and redefined it to teach about him. And that's what's happening here. Crucifixion, it wasn't invented for Jesus. Jesus took it, the Lord took it and redefined it. And now it made it a symbol of hope, which is a bizarrely opposite impression from the way people saw it at that time. It was humiliating, and now it's, even for us, it's hopeful and optimistic. The cross, a torturous death, and we have jewelry, and it's an image of hope. The no sandals thing we just talked about, having a holy ark, the idea of just having one at all. That's an Egyptian idea. Is there archaeological evidence the Hebrews came out of Egypt? Among it, yes. And among it are the two arks found in King Tut's tomb and the other arks we found in other ancient temples throughout the country. Why do the Israelites even have an Ark of the Covenant? It's evidence they came out of a culture that produced that initial idea. Is there evidence of the Israelites coming from Egypt? That's part of it. And I mentioned last week, it's not in this slide, circumcision. It was practiced on the royal family and on certain priests. And then God tells Abraham to start doing it for all the males in his family. He doesn't ask, what is that? He already knew. And redefined it like a parable to teach about being his people. In a sense, Abraham, you and your descendants, you're like royalty. You're like priests because of your faith in me. And so God has always taken languages and cultures that people speak and know and use them for his purposes. And in doing so, we look in Egypt and we see the original ideas that the Hebrews later were given, redefined by God. And that is all evidence that the Hebrews did come from Egypt. These ideas didn't exist in other places. They're Egyptian. And so, yes. Let's look at another place. This is an aerial shot of a temple, Medinat Habu. I know, Gesundheit, right? Bless you. No. Medinat Habu, that's the Egyptian name, it doesn't matter. But you see the ruins here. You see this wall and ruins around it. You see this building in the middle. And if you look carefully around it, other foundations of other things. This was what we call a mortuary temple. When pharaohs died, their mummies would be buried, and they make a temple, kind of like a museum, like a holy museum, where they would be remembered. And it contained records of their achievements as king. And it was to be remembered for the afterlife. And so you didn't live there. It was to celebrate your reign. You were buried somewhere else. This is a mortuary temple for a pharaoh called Ramses III. And that was the mortuary temple. Inside used to be all sorts of things about his life and traditions. But interestingly, this one also came to be used as a palace residence, which is not normal. Normally, pharaohs lived on the east bank of the Nile, where the sun rises, and they were buried on the west bank of the Nile, where the sun sets. And of course, those reasons make sense. You never live on the west bank of the Nile as a pharaoh, but he did. Why was he different? This area over here, these ruins, that used to be the palace, or a palace for Ramses III. Why is it over here next to his death temple, his funeral temple? That's not where you live. Why is he there? Why is there's this big wall around it? That's not typical. And this gate, it's fortified. There's a very narrow entrance. There are battle scenes all over it. There are spouts near the gate to pour boiling oil down on people if they're trying to get in. It's defensible. Why are you fortifying your mortuary temple? That's not what you do. You fortify like your palaces. Ramses III lived in very dangerous times. Egypt was invaded at least 3 times. Once by the Libyans and 2 times from people twice by the Libyans and once by people coming in by boat from the sea. There are all sorts of inscriptions and pictures of battles throughout that temple. He was a wartime pharaoh. And here's one inscription. He was around during the time of the judges. So here's one thing he says. He gives a report. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands of the Mediterranean. All at once, the lands were removed and scattered. No one could stand before them. He lists several, from the Hittites, who were totally destroyed, to several other areas, everyone being cut off about the same time. Some massive world order changing event wiped out most of the countries. And there are hints of this. And the whole world order fell. And it was a very dangerous period. And the Bible hints at a difference. If you look at Canaan, the time of Abraham and Isaac, and even Jacob, it's a pretty stable place all in all. It's safe to travel on the roads. There's a lot of diplomacy. Violence is pretty rare. There's like when Lot was captured. But other than that, we don't read of much. There are things here and there, but not huge wars. Now, there are cities with kings, but you go to the time of the judges. What's Canaan like during the time of the judges? It's crazy. It's like the Wild West. There are invasions. They're always being overrun by someone, people from outside coming in, stealing their food, oppressing them. There are bandits. There are raiders. Jephthah, the judge, was actually a bandit before he became a judge. Where are the police? Why wasn't all this happening during the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob? It's a different world. All the countries that keep things stable, they were conquered and overrun by what Ramses was talking about, these invasions. He describes how they were up in Syria, and they desolated the people there. Its land was like that which never came into being, Ramses writes. They were coming forward towards Egypt, the flame prepared before them. Ramses is writing about everything being destroyed, and now they're coming for us. And it's a very dramatic thing, isn't it? Imagine if someone overran and conquered Russia and China and India and all the European countries, and now they're coming for the United States. I mean, it's something like that. It's changing everything. And look at that drawing of the battle scene. It's crazy. But you see the boats in there? They came by boat from the north on the Mediterranean Sea. And Ramses lists all these names that are not familiar. Peliset, Jeker, Shekeles, Donuna, Weshes, lands united. Anyway, and they came in. It says the islands. He mentioned the islands came together. It looks like a bunch of different island peoples joining forces and attacking, which is what happened. And there's a whole other thing, why, what, how this come to be. The point is, they came against Egypt next, and Ramses had to fight them. And look at that chaos there, up in where the Nile flows into the Mediterranean Sea. Ramses happened to win. And so he made pictures of his victory all over this temple. But one of those groups he mentioned, we might recognize, the Peleset. Look at the consonants, P-L-S-T. It doesn't take but just slight tweaking to make Philistine. And then today we still use a version of that name. The Romans called the land Palestina at one point. That's where Palestine comes from. The Peleset, they were one of these island groups. What happened? Why were they becoming Philistines? Well, we know from history and archaeology they came into Egypt. Ramses beat them and allowed them to go and resettle over in Canaan. And they became the Philistines of the time of Saul and David. And they seem to have come from islands in the Mediterranean, including some Greek islands. If you look at the story of Goliath, he had the full description of his armor and weapons. Look at it, he's described, his armor and weapons are those of a Greek soldier. And the idea of having one soldier from each army, a combat of champions and everyone just watches, that's out of the Greek story, the Iliad. Achilles versus Hector and some things like that. You get to the Canaan and you have Goliath and the Philistines. Some of these Greek indications start coming out in the story, and the Hebrews don't know what to do with it. Goliath's main weapon, it's this huge spear, like how does the Hebrew describe it? Like a weaver's beam. See, there's not a Hebrew word for that kind of weapon. It's a Greek thrusting spear, 6 to 8 feet long. Reach out and touch somebody. Hebrew doesn't have a word for that. You see these Greek origins coming there. They came from the islands around Greece into Egypt and then were put into Canaan. And this is the guy who did it. He built this, though. Dangerous times. He found it safer to build his mortuary temple into a residence and surround it with a fortified wall and gate. That's how dangerous it was in that time. You go in there and you see all sorts of things. There's Ramses on the left, presenting something to the guy on the right with the big hat. That's the god Amun. You zoom in, what is Ramses doing? And they're people. Those are the people who attacked. If you look carefully, you might see some of them have beards and some of them don't. They're different peoples. They don't all look the same. Different groups from different islands, right? That's what he's showing there. And there I did it again. Man, I got to learn how to deal with this thing. Okay, come on, there we go. Zoom in, there are the people. Here's another image right here near the gate, and it's very damaged. But if you zoom in, that big guy, look who he is. Those are some of the prisoners from the islands who came in. Look at them, they don't look the same. The one in the middle has this sort of hat thing. The other guys don't have it. Their beards are different shapes. They're different groups that banded together, and you see that in how Egypt records the battle and the prisoners from it. And so here's a picture. You see those hats again, a little more detailed. They seem like feathers. And some people consider these prisoners who invaded Egypt, some people call them proto-Philistines. These are the peoples who were allowed to resettle in Canaan and became the Philistines later, the Peleset. Their name seems to have been used, but other groups are in there that were mentioned. They were kind of blended in. But these are indications of the origins of the biblical Philistines. And Egypt contains a key part of that story at this temple. Here they are collecting hands of dead people and presenting them to Ramses. The Bible talks about the bodies of enemies being hands and feet chopped off sometimes, that ritual mutilation. And in the gate we see a statue of the Egyptian goddess of war, Sekhmet. No surprise that Sekhmet would be the idol honored here because that's the goddess of war, and they won the war. It's like a lion's head with these pharaoh-looking things on the side. But all of this connects with the biblical Philistines and gives us some information about their background. The Bible remembers them coming from the island of Crete, and we have evidence of all this right here. Let's go in the few minutes we have left to the Karnak temple. It's actually on the east side of the Nile, where pharaohs usually lived, across from Medina Habu that we were just looking at. This was a huge temple, and every pharaoh added on something new to it. It was always under construction. The longer you reigned, the more you might be able to add. Even King Tut, who just reigned a few years as a teenager, there's a wall that was his, that he added onto it. Others like Ramses II, who was pharaoh for like 70 years, close to, he added all kinds of things. But you go in here, and that's the lake where all the pharaohs would be coronated. If you want to be pharaoh, you come to this temple, you have a ceremony at this lake, and now you're officially the pharaoh. But I want to look at two things in here. One area has all these big stone columns. They're huge, and they're like 120-something, 140-something of them, and they represent papyrus plants. Some of them are flared out like open-top flowers of papyrus, and some are straight like a closed flower papyrus. Papyrus was considered a way to get to the gods through education and learning, but some of the paint is even preserved. But what's the deal with these columns? I think they explain something we see in the Bible. If you go to 1 Kings, Solomon built the temple. He also built a new palace for himself, but it also mentions he built something called the House of the Forest of Lebanon. And we don't really know much about it. It seems to have been connected or related to the palace in some way. It says it's built on 4 rows of cedar pillars, cedar beams on top of the pillars, rows of cedar pillars. So the little information we have, this is just a guess right here of the architecture of the temple on top, his palace in the middle, and on the bottom, the House of the Forest of Lebanon. This is a guess. We can't really dig in any of these areas. But you see all those rows of columns on the bottom. Why would he build something like that? That's Egyptian architecture. How does a pharaoh declare how great he and his gods are? They had these temples had these rows of stone columns. And Karnak has all these big columns I was just showing you. And we go in there and we see all those. If you're wanting to show yourself back then to be a powerful king, Solomon's a powerful king. What does he do? He shows it in the ways they showed it in that time. Pharaohs, the greatest kings of all. Solomon appears to make his own version of the pillared hall like that. He doesn't have the same wide open, flat real estate. He's building it all on top of a hill, less space. But the pharaohs used stone. What did Solomon use as his building material for the columns? Cedar wood imported from Lebanon, from Phoenicia. Fine stuff, aromatic. You ever walked into a cedar closet? The aroma, it's amazing. So if you're going to visit Solomon, what happens? You go to visit a pharaoh, you might walk through all these stone columns with hieroglyphs. What's Solomon doing? He's showing people, I am the great king now. And you go to visit Solomon, you probably walk through these rows of cedar columns and the aromas and the finery. And it's not as big as what there is in Egypt, but it's nicer. And it smells amazing, and it shows what Solomon is. He's great and refined and educated, appreciates the good things in life. And that seems to illuminate what the Bible's talking about there. How do we understand this? Egypt gives us an indication. He was showing Egypt and everyone that he was the new great king in the region. That's standard royal architecture, and he takes that and makes it his own. There's one other place in this great temple. This wall doesn't look very impressive right now, but it was built by a pharaoh named Shishak, and maybe some of you recognize the name Shishak. He's a biblical pharaoh, mentioned by name. After Solomon died, his son Rehoboam split Israel and Judah into 2 parts, Israel and Judah, the kingdoms. Shishak was pharaoh of Egypt when that happened. He went up and invaded. And the Bible says that he went up and attacked and took all the gold that Solomon had accumulated. He plundered Jerusalem and took all the money that Solomon had accumulated. On the wall are rows of these guys. They look like soldiers with shields. Those aren't shields. Those represent cities and towns. If you look carefully, you'll see little bumps on the edge of the shield. Those represent towers and city walls. And the name in the middle is the name of a city or town that he conquered. So this is a list of all the cities and towns Shishak conquered during his invasion. And we learn from this, he didn't just go to Judah. He went to Israel and some other countries through the whole region, made a big campaign and got a lot of money from it. And this is the bigger wall showing more of it. And the Bible mentions this invasion. The 5th year of Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. This wall records that invasion, and it gives us a date. When did it happen? The Bible doesn't really give us dates that correspond to our calendar, but Egypt, we know how to correspond their dates to our calendar. The Bible says the 5th year of Rehoboam is when Shishak came up. From comparing the calendar information on that wall, we realize Shishak's invasion was around 925 BC. And so the 5th year, if that was the 5th year of Rehoboam's reign, what was the first year? Counting backwards is BC. Go back 5 years, about 930. That's when Solomon died and Rehoboam became king. So now we have a timestamp. Look what else we can put together from that. Years. So if he died in 930, what's 40 years before that? 970 BC. So his reign began around 970. And then we keep going from there. It mentions David was king at Hebron for 7.5 years roughly, at Jerusalem 33 years. So we can put those numbers in. David begins in Hebron about 1010 BC. In Jerusalem about 1003. And then we have this reference in 1 Kings 6. In the 480th year after the Exodus, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, the house of the Lord, the temple, begins to be built. So put this in there with what we have. When was the temple built? The 4th year of Solomon it started. Solomon started in 970, so about 966. Go back 480 years and we get a date for the Exodus. Doing the math puts us about 1446 BC. See how that one wall can help us date all kinds of things in the Bible. Archeology helps us get a timeline, a chronology, and so that's useful. Let's finish up with this one. There's a replica of the Ark in this other temple. Here's a temple nearby called Luxor, the temple of Luxor. In the Bible, Luxor was called Thebes. It was the capital of Egypt in the time of Moses and the judges, up until Ramses III, actually. That changed everything. But Luxor, that's the ark that a replica of the ark that used to be in the Holy of Holies at Luxor. See, another ark. But the Bible says Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. These temples on the east were used as temples to worship. They were also used as schools and sometimes hospitals. So where was Moses educated if he's connected with the royal family? He's educated in a temple. This was the capital of Egypt. This is the main temple. Moses appears to have been educated in this building. And so you walk through the ruins of Luxor, the temple there. That was ancient Thebes. That's where Moses was raised, being adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And so in these courtyards and some of these columns, Moses knew them. He would have known them. And so if you go there, you're walking in the steps of Moses. Okay, well, that's our time, and that's my last slide. So that worked out very well. Of course, there's so much more that we could talk about, but this is just a snippet. That Egypt is not as well known in archaeological discussions, but there are some very interesting things there that illuminate the Bible and give evidence of the Hebrews' origins in Egypt, which is evidence for the whole Exodus story to begin with. So thank you for your kind attention. I appreciate it.